Let's talk to Joe Twyman, the co-founder of Deltapoll, who's here in the studio with me. Joe, welcome here to the programme. So we've got 2 days to go. What are you keeping your eye on?
I'm keeping my eye on the don't knows. Those are the people who, up until this point, perhaps haven't been paying as much attention as us, or as much attention as the average person in the street, or the 50% of people less engaged than the average person in the street. We know that around about a third to 40% of people make up their mind during the campaign, and a lot of those will do it in the final week. Now, making your mind up isn't the same as changing your mind, and it can be making your mind up on which party to vote for, or deciding on whether to vote or not. But a lot of people, millions, will be making that decision this week.
You've been talking to people all the way through the campaign. You said an interesting thing then about people changing their view. Give me a sense of how many people you are talking to that are actually making that decision to move from one place to another.
It seems relatively small during the duration of the campaign. A lot of people's decisions were made up a long time ago, and while people may still be uncertain that they're definitely going to stick with that, the vast majority appear to be, in terms of their thinking, where they were not just at the beginning of the campaign, probably at the beginning of the year, perhaps even longer than that.
It's interesting because, as we were saying there with the poll tracker, broadly, and I know there are variations within it, but broadly the polls haven't squeezed and moved between Labour and Conservative. What does that suggest to you? Does that suggest that the campaigns haven't been as effective as they should have been, or does it suggest perhaps that broadly people are not listening?
Some people won't be paying attention until later on, and that's certainly true. But for a lot of people, it just demonstrates the strength of feeling. It demonstrates that people really had made up their mind, as I say, some time ago, because of a series of events. We've seen a number of turning points in British politics over the last few years. And during the campaign, we've had various talking points, but little in the way of things that would actually address those long-standing beliefs, grudges, hypes that people have.
How fluid do you think British politics is now? I was struck by being in one constituency, which was a traditional Conservative constituency, and talking to a traditional Conservative voter, and they said, look, we're not going to vote Conservative again, but I'm toying between Labour and Reform. And when you look at that on the face of it, it almost defies logic that you could sort of have a choice like that. So how fluid are things here among parts of the electorate? A
lot more fluid than they used to be even a few years ago, and certainly decades ago. Political promiscuity, this idea that you will move from one party to another, is far, far more popular nowadays than it has been previously. And to put that in context, in order to get a majority of just two, Labour needed a swing in the vote from Conservative to Labour greater than had ever been achieved in British post-war history. Bigger, certainly, than Tony Blair achieved in 1997. And yet, it appears that not only, if current polling does hold on the day of the election, not only is that going to be achieved, it's going to be achieved by some distance. And so these swings that we see, not just from Conservative to Labour, but from all of the different parties in different parts of the country, could have an enormous impact on the political map.
And I suppose that's why we've been concentrating in some of our conversations today on where the party leaders are actually campaigning in these final hours. A final question then about voter turnout. How much of a difference potentially can that make? And in the last election, off the top of your head, what was it?
62 off the top of my head. The only time it's been below 60 was in 2001 when it dropped to 59%. I think had Reform not surged in the polls during the campaign, we might have been looking lower than that this time around. But it is a very difficult thing to estimate. And so I imagine somewhere between sort of 60 and 65, broadly in line with where it's been in previous elections, is likely to be similar this time.
A final thought, because you mentioned Reform. We've seen the rise in the polls since Nigel Farage entered the race, but of course a lot of attention in the last few days from the Putin scandals and comments and concentration on that, and then of course all the attention on candidates. Has there been any sort of movement since those stories made quite big headlines?
There doesn't appear to have been a major impact, but of course this is not one contest, this is 650 individual contests, and in specific constituencies people may say, well actually my candidate for Reform, or indeed for other parties, is not exactly who I'm looking for, so I'm going to vote for somebody else, despite the fact that I might like Nigel Farage, say, or the party nationally.
Joe Twyman, with just 2 days to go. Thanks for that latest assessment, Joe Twyman there from Deltapoll.